The
This
night the
behavior is
alarm
unacceptable and will
screamed,
not be
a
tolerated in this
single
department.
father
The
froze
decision
in a
is
hospital
final.
corridor, knowing one wrong move could cost him his job. Security boots thundered closer, while his son clutched his sleeve, eyes wide, ears wrapped in silence. In that instant, fear wasn't loud. It was procedural, cold, and official. This story begins not with power or privilege, but with a man who cleans floors after midnight. He works the graveyard shift because daylight belongs to bills, school pickups, and exhaustion. His son sits nearby on a plastic chair, fingers tracing shapes that mean safety when words fail. Sign language is their bridge, learned in emergency rooms and long nights when hope had to be handmade. The hospital hums with machines, policies, and hurry, a place where silence is often misunderstood. Here, compassion is scheduled, credentials matter, and mistakes carry forms instead of forgiveness. The father knows these rules, so he keeps his head down and his hands gentle. Yet gentleness draws attention when a frightened child needs it most. A small patient nearby trembles, unable to hear reassurances rushing past her. The father kneels, signs slowly, and a miracle happens without witnesses. Two children smile, and the corridor briefly forgets how to be cruel. That kindness, however, breaks protocol, and protocol never forgets. What follows will test how institutions treat the invisible and who is allowed to help. It will ask whether presence can outweigh rank and whether listening requires sound. At its heart, this is a story about a single dad choosing to be seen. It is about learning that dignity can arrive quietly, carried on steady hands. And it begins the moment silence speaks louder than authority. In a place built for urgency, his patience becomes the quiet disruption no policy prepared for. Stay with him because the smallest gestures tonight will change more than anyone expects. The hospital after midnight was a different world, one that existed beneath the version people saw in daylight. By day, it was bright, efficient, almost hopeful. By night, it became quieter, heavier, stripped down to its bones. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, never fully dark, never fully kind. Machines breathed for people who could not. Monitors beeped in slow, patient rhythms. And somewhere deep in the building, the floors were still being cleaned. He had learned long ago that night work required a certain invisibility. You moved quietly, kept your eyes down, made yourself small enough to pass through important spaces without interrupting them. The single father understood this better than most. He wore it the way he wore his uniform, clean, faded, functional. No name embroidered on the chest, just a badge clipped near the collar with a barcode and a photo taken on a bad day. He did not mind. Names were heavy things, responsibilities even heavier. He worked the overnight sanitation shift, a job that existed because mess never slept. Someone always spilled something, someone always bled, someone always broke down in a hallway when no one was watching. He mopped around grief as carefully as he did around cords and machines, knowing where not to step, what not to touch. This was not just a workplace. It was a place where people came apart. His son sat where he always did, on a hard plastic chair against the wall near the nurse's station. The chair was too big for him, his feet dangling a few inches above the floor. A small backpack rested against his legs, the zipper broken, the strap repaired with a knot that had been retied many times. Inside were crayons, a folded notebook, a flashlight, and a pair of oversized ear protectors, the kind used at construction sites or fireworks shows. They had become necessary after the accident. The boy did not complain. He never did. He simply watched. The father glanced over every few minutes, not obviously, not enough to draw attention. He had perfected the art of looking without seeming to look, a habit learned through years of raising a child alone, through schools and clinics and offices where men like him were either ignored or scrutinized. The boy met his gaze and raised his hand slightly. fingers moving in a familiar shape. "You okay?" The father nodded and signed back, slow and steady. "I'm here." The boy smiled, small and crooked, then went back to his drawing. They had learned sign language in pieces, out of necessity rather than intention. After the accident, when sound became unreliable, when words slipped through cracks neither of them understood yet, hands had become the safest way to speak. They practiced at home with videos paused and replayed late into the night. They practiced in waiting rooms, in hallways like this one, in moments when panic threatened to swallow them whole. Signing was not elegant, it was practical. It worked. That was enough. The father pushed the mop bucket forward, the wheels squeaking slightly, despite repeated attempts to fix them. He winced, then relaxed when no one looked up. The nurses were busy, charting, whispering, moving with the tired efficiency of people who had learned to survive on caffeine and compartmentalization. Doctors passed through in clusters, murmuring in low voices, their coats swinging open like capes. No one noticed the man cleaning the floor. That was fine. He preferred it that way. There was a time when he had wanted more, not ambition exactly, but stability. A schedule that made sense. A life where he did not have to bring his child to work because childcare ended at 5 and emergencies did not. But life did not negotiate. It simply presented problems and waited to see what you would do with them. So he adapted. He chose the night shift because it paid a little more and asked fewer questions, because his son slept better when the world was quiet, because hospitals, for all their rules, understood brokenness better than most places. He rounded the corner near the pediatric wing, slowing instinctively. This area always carried a different weight. Smaller beds, brighter murals meant to distract from fear, the smell of disinfectant mixed with something softer, sweeter, like the ghost of bubblegum toothpaste. He cleaned here more carefully, as if the floor itself might bruise. That was when he noticed her. The girl sat on the floor near a closed door, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tight around herself. She wore a thin hospital gown and socks that were too big, the kind with rubber grips on the bottom. Her hair was tangled, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. She rocked slightly, back and forth, her movements small but urgent. At first, he assumed a nurse or parent would come any moment. Children were rarely alone in hospitals for long. But minutes passed. No one came. The girl's eyes darted whenever footsteps echoed down the corridor. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. She pressed her palms against her ears, then dropped them again, frustration flashing across her face. Whatever she was experiencing, it was not getting better. The father felt that familiar pull in his chest, the one that warned him he was about to step outside his lane. He hesitated. Rules mattered in places like this, so did appearances. A man in a janitor's uniform approaching a child alone in a hospital corridor was not a situation anyone wanted to explain. He had learned this the hard way over the years, through sideways looks and unnecessary questions. He had learned to keep his distance, but he had also learned something else. He knew what panic looked like when sound failed. He knew what it meant to be surrounded by people who could not hear you even when they were talking nonstop. He glanced back toward the nurse's station. No one was watching. His son had noticed the girl too, his drawing forgotten, his posture alert. The boy met his father's eyes and signed a single word: scared. The father exhaled slowly. He set the mop against the wall and approached the girl, careful to make his presence visible long before he reached her. He stayed a few steps away and lowered himself to one knee, keeping his hands open, his movements deliberate. He did not speak. Instead, he placed his hand over his heart and signed, "Hello." The girl froze, her eyes locked onto his hands, her breath catching as if she were afraid the moment might vanish if she moved too quickly. Then, tentatively, she lifted her own hands. "Hello." The relief on her face was immediate and devastating. She signed quickly after that, clumsy with emotion, her hands trembling as she tried to explain something he could not fully catch yet. Too much noise. Lights, head hurts, can't hear. Mom not here. He nodded, slowing her down gently with his own hands. It's okay. You're safe. I'm here. She swallowed hard, her shoulders dropping a fraction as the tension eased. The rocking stopped. Behind him, he sensed movement. His son had slipped from the chair and padded quietly over, kneeling beside him without a word. The boy signed to the girl with an ease that came from being young and unafraid. Do you like drawing? The girl blinked, then nodded. The boy unzipped his backpack and held out the notebook and crayons, like an offering. Her fingers brushed the paper, hesitant at first, then more confidently. She began to draw shaky lines that slowly turned into shapes. A house, a tree, two stick figures holding hands. The father watched, his chest tight. For a few fragile minutes, the hospital corridor softened. The lights did not flicker as harshly. The hum of machines faded into the background. Two children sat on the floor, sharing a language most of the building did not notice. It could have ended there. It should have ended there. But places built on order do not tolerate unscripted kindness for long. Footsteps approached, sharper this time, purposeful. A voice cut through the air, brisk and startled. Hey, what's going on here? The father turned slowly, already knowing this moment would come. The voice belonged to a nurse. She stood a few steps away, arms crossed loosely over her chest. Posture neutral, but alert in the way people learned when responsibility outweighed curiosity. Her badge caught the light as she shifted her weight, eyes moving from the man in the sanitation uniform to the two children on the floor, then back again. Nothing in her expression suggested accusation, but nothing suggested ease either. The father rose slowly to his feet, keeping his hands visible. He had learned this instinctively over the years, the small movements that communicated compliance before words ever entered the room. He did not rush. Rushing made people nervous. I'm sorry, the nurse said, lowering her voice as she stepped closer. This area is restricted. Who are you? He gestured gently toward the girl and signed to her first, not wanting to disappear without explanation. He told her he would be right there, that she was not in trouble, that none of this was her fault. She nodded, gripping the crayon tighter in her fist. Only then did he turn to the nurse. He spoke aloud now, his voice quiet, steady. I work here. Night sanitation. He gestured vaguely toward the mop bucket leaning against the wall. She seemed overwhelmed. She's deaf. The nurse's eyes flicked back to the girl, then to the boy beside him. The boy met her gaze without fear, signing something quickly to his father. She's scared they'll make her leave. The father exhaled and translated softly. My son noticed her first. The nurse hesitated. She knelt down to the girl's level, speaking gently but too quickly, the way people often did when they were unsure how to help. The girl stared back, confusion returning to her face as her eyes searched for meaning that never arrived. The nurse stopped mid-sentence. Oh, she said quietly. She can't hear me, can she? The father shook his head. I didn't realize, the nurse admitted, straightening. Her chart says hearing impairment, but she trailed off, frustration flashing briefly across her face, not at the situation, but at herself. Her mother's a doctor here. She stepped into an emergency case. I was supposed to keep an eye on her. The father nodded. He had learned not to judge people by their worst moments. Hospitals produce plenty of those. Is she okay? The nurse asked, glancing at the girl. She was panicking, he replied. Lights, noise, too much. The nurse sighed, rubbing her temple. We've been short-staffed all night. There it was, not an excuse, not an apology, just a truth that sat between them. The nurse turned back to the children and crouched again, slower this time, watching the father's hands as he signed reassurance. She mimicked him awkwardly, trying to copy a simple motion, her fingers stiff and uncertain. The girl watched with cautious interest. The father felt a flicker of something unexpected. Gratitude, perhaps. or recognition. The nurse was trying. That counted for something. "I'll call her mother," the nurse said, rising again. "She shouldn't be alone." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for helping." The words landed gently, but they did not settle. Because the hospital did not exist in moments. It existed in systems. As the nurse walked away, the father felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the warning that attention had been drawn, and attention rarely traveled alone. He signed to the girl one last time, promising she would see her mother soon. His son squeezed her hand briefly, then returned to his side. Together they stood and stepped back, giving space, returning to where they belonged, or where they were expected to belong. The mop bucket waited patiently. He picked it up and resumed his route, the rhythm of work grounding him as it always did. Push, pull, rinse, repeat. The boy returned to his chair, though his eyes followed the girl until she was gone, escorted gently by another nurse this time. For a while, everything seemed to settle. The hospital resumed its hum, but something had shifted. It always did when kindness disrupted the flow. An hour later, as he cleaned near the elevators, a security officer approached. The man was broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable in the practiced way of someone trained not to reveal intent. "Sir," the officer said, "can I speak with you for a moment?" The father nodded, setting the mop aside. The officer gestured toward a quieter alcove. The boy noticed immediately, rising from his chair, his face tense. The father signed to him, "Stay here. I'll be right back." The boy hesitated, then nodded. The alcove smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. The officer leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "There was a report," the officer began, "about an unauthorized interaction with a pediatric patient." The words were formal, rehearsed. The father recognized the language of documentation. It was not personal. That made it worse. "I understand," the father replied calmly. "She was distressed. I helped until a nurse arrived." The officer studied him for a long moment. "You know how this looks?" The father did. He nodded. "I wasn't alone," he said. "My son was there." "That's part of the concern," the officer replied. "Children aren't supposed to be in staff-only areas during overnight shifts." The father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have permission," he said, "from my supervisor." The officer's brow furrowed. "That may be, but situations involving patients, especially minors, are sensitive." Behind the officer, through the glass, the boy watched them, fingers twisting the strap of his backpack. The father caught his eye and signed again, slower this time. "It's okay." The officer followed his gaze. "Your son is deaf?" the officer asked, his tone shifting slightly. "Yes." The officer nodded, absorbing that. "And the patient?" "Yes." Silence stretched between them. "I'm not saying you did anything wrong," the officer said finally, "but we have protocols." The father almost smiled. "I know," he said quietly, because protocols were the language of institutions. They spoke it fluently. "What happens now?" the father asked. The officer exhaled. "I need to file a report." "Standard procedure?" "It'll be reviewed." "Probably nothing comes of it." "Probably." The word hovered between them, heavy with possibility. The officer hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, my sister's deaf. I wish more people took the time." The father met his eyes. "So do I." The officer nodded once, then stepped away. The father returned to his mop, to his son, to the quiet labor that had always sustained them. But the ease was gone. The night pressed closer, the walls more watchful. In a nearby wing, the girl sat on a bed, her feet swinging just above the floor. Her mother stood beside her, still in scrubs, her face lined with exhaustion and something sharper, guilt, perhaps. The girl signed quickly, urgently, trying to explain what had happened. The mother struggled to keep up. She had learned some signs, enough for basics, enough to function, but not enough to follow the rush of emotion pouring out of her child's hands. "Slow down," she said aloud, even as she tried to sign it. The girl's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," the mother whispered, reaching for her. "I had a patient crash. I couldn't leave." The girl nodded. She understood emergencies. She had grown up around them. But understanding did not erase fear. She signed again, smaller this time. "Man helped me with his son." The mother froze. "What man?" she asked. The girl described him the best way she knew how. Uniform, kind hands, quiet. The mother's stomach dropped. She stepped into the hallway and flagged down a nurse. "Who was with my daughter earlier?" she asked. The nurse hesitated. "A sanitation worker. He knows sign language. He helped calm her down." The mother closed her eyes briefly. She had spent years mastering medicine, learning to read monitors, interpret data, make decisions under pressure. She had prided herself on competence, on control. And yet, when her daughter had needed understanding most, it had come from someone else. Someone without authority, without credentials, someone who simply knew how to listen. The mother leaned against the wall, the weight of that realization settling heavily in her chest. Back down the corridor, the father finished his shift section by section, the hours ticking by. The boy dozed intermittently, his head resting against the wall, his drawings scattered at his feet. As dawn crept closer, the hospital changed again. Day staff arrived. Voices grew louder. The night released its hold. The father signed to his son. "Almost done." The boy smiled sleepily. They did not know yet how deeply the night would follow them, but the hospital did, and it remembered. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in through narrow windows and glass doors, thin strips of pale light cutting across linoleum floors that had just been cleaned. The hospital shifted its weight as the night staff signed out, and the day staff took their places, trading quiet endurance for brisk urgency. Voices grew louder, pages echoed overhead, the smell of coffee replaced the sharp sting of disinfectant. For most people, it was just another morning. For the single father, it felt like standing at the edge of something he could not yet see. He finished his final section near the pediatric wing, movement slower now, fatigue settling into his shoulders. His son gathered their things without being asked, practiced in the rituals of departure. Backpack on, crayons returned, ear protectors adjusted. The boy signed as he packed. Did I do something wrong? The question landed harder than any accusation. The father crouched in front of him, meeting his eyes at the same level. He placed his hands firmly, deliberately in view. "No, you were kind." The boy frowned slightly, his brow creasing. Then why did the man look angry? The father paused. "Because some people are afraid of things they don't understand." The boy absorbed that, quiet and thoughtful. They moved toward the exit, blending into the flow of staff ending their shifts. No one stopped them. No one said goodbye. That too was familiar. Outside, the air was cold and damp, the sky washed in gray. The father zipped his jacket higher around his son and began the walk toward the bus stop, the hospital looming behind them like a silent witness. Neither of them spoke. By the time they reached home, the father's phone buzzed. Once, then again. He stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hello? This is hospital administration," a voice said, professional and distant. "We need you to come in today. There was an incident reported during your shift." The father closed his eyes briefly. "I just got off," he replied evenly. "We're aware. This is a follow-up. Please come by this afternoon." He glanced at his son, who was watching his face closely, reading emotion the way he had learned to read hands. "I'll be there," the father said. The call ended. The apartment was quiet when they entered, the kind of quiet that followed long nights. The boy curled up on the couch and fell asleep almost immediately, exhaustion overtaking concern. The father watched him for a moment before covering him with a blanket. Then he sat at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at nothing. He had been careful. He had done nothing wrong. And still, hospitals were not cruel places. They were cautious ones. By early afternoon, he stood in a small office with frosted glass walls. A woman from Human Resources sat across from him, a thin folder open in front of her. A security officer stood near the door, arms relaxed but presence unmistakable. "This is not disciplinary," the woman began. "We're just documenting the situation." The father nodded. She asked him to recount the night. He did plainly without embellishment. He explained the girl's distress, his decision to help, his son's presence. He did not justify himself. He simply told the truth. The woman listened, pen moving steadily. "You understand," she said, "why this raises concerns." "I understand," he replied, "especially given your position." The phrase stung more than he expected, his position, as if kindness carried different weight depending on the uniform worn. "We have to consider patient safety," she continued. "Boundaries exist for a reason." The father met her gaze. "So does fear." The woman hesitated, then sighed softly. "This isn't a reprimand," she repeated, "but we'll need you to sign this acknowledgement." He read the document carefully. The language was precise, neutral, stripped of context. He signed. When he left the office, his job remained intact, but something else had been marked. In another part of the hospital, the girl sat beside her mother in a consultation room. The mother's hands rested in her lap, fingers tapping unconsciously against her knee. She had barely slept. The image of her daughter on the floor, frightened and alone, replayed on a loop she could not silence. The girl signed again, retelling the story for the third time. The mother followed better now, concentration etched into her face. Man had son. He knew hands. He stayed. The mother swallowed. "Did he touch you?" she asked carefully. The girl shook her head, almost offended by the question. "No." He sat. He listened. The mother leaned back, closing her eyes. She had spent her life in rooms where people listened to her, where her words carried weight, where decisions followed her voice, and yet she had failed at the simplest thing, being there. Later that day, she sought out the nurse who had first intervened. "Did he do anything inappropriate?" she asked bluntly. The nurse shook her head. "No, he helped. Honestly, he handled it better than most of us would have." That night, the mother went home and sat at her kitchen table long after her daughter had gone to bed. She opened her laptop, not to check work email, but to search. Sign language basics, deaf children, anxiety hospital, how to communicate without sound. She watched videos slowly, pausing often, practicing simple signs in the quiet of her kitchen. Meanwhile, the father returned to work the next night. Nothing had changed, and everything had. He felt eyes on him more often. Not hostile, not overt, just aware. He worked as he always had, methodical, careful, professional. His son stayed close, quieter than usual, his fingers restless. Near midnight, the father received another call. This time, it was not from administration. "Hi," the voice said, tentative. "This is Dr. Harris. I'm the mother of the girl from last night." The father's heart skipped. "Yes," he said. "I wanted to thank you," she continued, "for helping my daughter and to apologize for not being there." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't owe me anything," he replied. "I think I do," she said softly, "and I have a question." She paused. "Would you be willing to teach me? Just the basics, so I can do better?" The father closed his eyes, emotion tightening his throat. "Yes," he said, "I would." They met later that week in a small hospital conference room. No titles, no hierarchy, just three people sitting at a table, hands learning new shapes. The boy helped too, patient and proud, correcting gently. The girl watched her mother's clumsy attempts and laughed, and in that quiet room something shifted again. Not loudly, not officially, but permanently. The hospital would continue to run on rules, on protocols, on forms and signatures, but somewhere within its walls, a new language had begun to take root, one that did not require permission. And the single father who had never asked to be seen found himself standing at the center of it. The meetings began quietly, no announcements, no emails marked urgent, just conversations that happened behind closed doors in offices where the blinds were always half drawn and the air smelled faintly of toner and old coffee. The father was not invited to those meetings, but he felt them anyway. It showed in the way supervisors lingered longer when passing his section, in the way schedules were adjusted without explanation, in the way his badge seemed to be checked more often than necessary. Nothing was said, nothing had to be. Institutions rarely punished openly when uncertainty could do the work instead. He continued showing up on time, continued doing his job exactly as he always had. He cleaned, he disinfected, he moved carefully through spaces where other people's lives were at their most fragile. And he brought his son with him because he still had no other choice. But the boy noticed the difference, the way conversations stopped when they approached, the way the father's shoulders stayed tense even during quiet moments. One night, while sitting on the familiar plastic chair, the boy signed slowly, "Are we in trouble?" The father took longer than usual to answer. "Not trouble," he signed. "Just watched." The boy frowned. "Why?" The father searched for the right words because sometimes when you do the right thing, people don't know where to put you anymore. The boy absorbed that silently. At home, the father began practicing signs more deliberately, not because his son needed him to, but because someone else did. Once a week after his shift, he met with the doctor and her daughter in the same small conference room. There was no official program, no paperwork, just borrowed time. The doctor arrived still in scrubs, exhaustion etched into her face, but her eyes were alert in a way they had not been before. She listened now, really listened. She stumbled often, signed words backward, mixed up meanings. Her daughter corrected her without mercy, then laughed and hugged her tight. The father sat across from them, guiding gently, never rushing. He had learned patience the hard way. You did not force understanding, you waited for it. These sessions became something like a refuge, a place where hierarchy dissolved, where no one cared about titles or roles, where hands spoke honestly, even when voices failed. But good things rarely remain untouched. One evening, as the father prepared to leave work, his supervisor stopped him near the supply room. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her tone was neutral, but her jaw was tight. They stepped inside the small room, shelves stacked high with gloves and cleaning solutions. The door closed softly behind them. "There have been concerns," she said, "about boundaries." The father nodded. "I understand." She sighed. This situation with the doctor and her daughter, while I respect your intentions, it's creating complications." "Complications for who?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "For the hospital." There it was again. Not for the child, not for safety, for the system. "You're being asked to stop the informal meetings," she continued. "If the family wants resources, they can go through official channels." The father met her eyes. "They tried that," he said. "It didn't work." Her expression softened briefly, then hardened again. "That may be, but we have to protect ourselves." "Protect ourselves," he nodded slowly. "Understood." The meeting stopped. The father told the girl and her mother the next time they met. The girl's face fell instantly. The doctor's shoulders slumped, disappointment flashing across her features. "This isn't your fault," the father signed carefully. The girl shook her head, angry tears forming. "Why do they always stop?" The father had no good answer. The next week, the hospital hosted a training seminar on inclusive patient care. It was mandatory for clinical staff, optional for others. The father did not attend. He was working. But the doctor sat in the back of the room listening as a consultant spoke about accessibility, about the importance of communication, about creating safe environments for patients with disabilities. The words were polished, The slides impressive, and yet something felt hollow. During the Q&A, the doctor raised her hand. "What happens," she asked, "when policy prevents care instead of enabling it?" The room went quiet. The consultant smiled politely. "Policies are designed to minimize risk." "Risk for whom?" the doctor pressed. The consultant shifted. "For the institution." That night, the doctor made a decision. She began advocating, quietly at first, then more openly. She wrote emails, requested meetings, asked questions that made people uncomfortable. She spoke not as a grieving mother or an emotional outlier, but as a physician who understood both medicine and humanity. And people listened. Not everyone, not immediately, but enough. The hospital announced the formation of a task force on accessibility and patient communication. Sign language training sessions were proposed. Pilot programs discussed. The father heard about it from another sanitation worker while emptying trash near the staff lounge. "Guess they're finally catching up," the coworker said with a shrug. The father said nothing. Progress, he had learned, was rarely linear. Then came the incident, a different child, a different night. The father was cleaning near the emergency department when alarms sounded. A young patient, hard of hearing and disoriented, began panicking. During a procedure, the room erupted into controlled chaos. A nurse shouted instructions. A doctor raised her voice, trying to cut through fear with volume. It didn't work. The child flailed, tears streaming, unable to understand what was happening. The father stood just outside the room, mop in hand, heart pounding. He was not supposed to intervene. He knew that. He also knew what panic looked like. He caught the doctor's eye through the glass and signed a single word, slowly. "Wait." The doctor hesitated just for a moment. Then she nodded. The father entered, hands raised, movements calm. He knelt beside the bed and signed to the child. "You're safe. They're helping you. Breathe." The child's eyes locked onto his hands. The screaming stopped. The room exhaled. Later, administration would call it a learning moment. There would be discussions, reviews, but this time something was different. This time, there were witnesses, doctors, nurses, staff who had seen fear dissolve not through authority but through understanding. The next morning, an email went out. Effective immediately, basic sign language support would be integrated into pediatric emergency protocols. Training sessions would begin within the month. Volunteers and staff with relevant skills were encouraged to come forward. The father read the email on his phone during a break, his son leaning against him. The boy signed, "Is that because of you?" The father shook his head gently, "Because of everyone." But the boy smiled anyway. Later that week, the father was called into another meeting. This one felt different. No security officer, no HR folder. The director of patient services sat across from him, hands folded, expression thoughtful. "We'd like to ask you something," she said. "Off the record?" The father nodded. "Would you consider helping us?" she asked. "Not as staff, as a consultant, for accessibility training." The father was quiet for a long moment. He thought of the meetings that had been stopped, the warnings, the looks. "Why now?" he asked. The director did not dodge the question. "Because we've been reacting," she said, "and we need to start learning." The father glanced at his son, who was watching intently. "Only if my son is included," he said. "This is his language too." The director smiled. "Of course." It wasn't a victory, not the kind stories usually told. No applause, no public recognition, just a shift, a slow, deliberate movement away from fear. The father returned to his work that night, mop in hand as always. But the hospital felt different, not kinder, not perfect, just listening. And for the first time, he believed that standing still might no longer be the cost of doing what was right. Change did not arrive with celebration. There was no announcement in the lobby, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no photograph pinned to a bulletin board with smiling faces and a carefully worded caption. Instead, change arrived the way most meaningful things did, quietly, unevenly, carried by people who had decided not to look away anymore. The father continued working nights. His uniform did not change. His badge still bore the same faded photo. He still pushed the same squeaking mop bucket down the same corridors, where the floors never truly stayed clean. But the way people looked at him had shifted. Some nodded now, some asked questions, some watched his hands when he spoke to his son, curiosity replacing suspicion. The boy noticed it first. One night, as they sat together during a break, he signed slowly, thoughtfully. They don't stare the same way. The father followed his gaze across the hallway, where a nurse paused mid-conversation to wave at them, before continuing on. "No," he signed back. "They don't." The boy smiled. Training sessions began the following month. Not many at first. A handful of nurses, a few doctors who stayed late after their shifts, exhaustion tugging at their eyes. The father was not listed as an instructor. Officially, he was a community consultant, a temporary role, flexible hours. Unofficially, he was something else entirely. He stood at the front of small rooms, hands steady, posture calm, and taught people how to slow down, how to wait for understanding instead of demanding it, how to let silence exist without rushing to fill it. His son often stood beside him, correcting signs with the blunt honesty only children possessed. "No," the boy would sign, shaking his head, amused. "That means bathroom." Laughter would ripple through the room, easing tension. Mistakes were allowed here. That alone changed everything. The doctor attended every session she could. She practiced relentlessly in elevators, in hallways, in quiet moments between patients. Her daughter noticed. One evening, as they walked home together, the girl signed something slowly, deliberately. "You're trying." The doctor swallowed. "Yes," she signed back. "I am." The girl nodded, satisfied. Not perfect, but present. At home, the father's life remained modest. Bills still arrived on time. Food still had to be stretched. Sleep still came in fragments, but something had eased. The boy laughed more now, signed faster, interrupted with stories about school, about friends who were learning his language with clumsy enthusiasm. One night, as the father tucked him into bed, the boy paused, hands hovering. "Why did you help that girl?" The father considered the question carefully. "Because no one should be alone when they're scared." The boy nodded. Then he asked, "Because you helped me?" The father smiled. "Yes, that was reason enough." The hospital continued to change in small, uneven ways. Some departments resisted. Some supervisors worried about liability. Some staff dismissed the efforts as symbolic. But symbols mattered. A sign language interpreter was added to the on-call list. Visual communication boards appeared in pediatric rooms. Policies were rewritten, not perfectly, not quickly, but deliberately. The father did not attend those meetings. He did not need to. His work was already done there. One evening, months later, the father and his son passed through the pediatric wing during a shift. A child sat on a bed, crying softly. A nurse knelt beside her, hands moving carefully. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. The father stopped. The boy squeezed his hand, eyes bright. They kept walking. Some things did not require interruption anymore. Near the end of the year, the hospital hosted a small gathering. Not a ceremony, just a meeting of people who had contributed to the accessibility initiative. Coffee was served, cookies placed awkwardly on paper plates. The director spoke briefly, thanking those involved. She did not single anyone out, but as people dispersed, she stopped the father. "I wanted you to know," she said quietly, "we wouldn't have started without you." The father shook his head. "You would have," he replied. "Eventually." She smiled, accepting the answer for what it was. That night, as the father and his son walked home under a sky heavy with clouds, the boy signed something new. "When I grow up, I want to help like that." The father looked down at him. You already do, the boy grinned. They reached their apartment building, climbed the familiar stairs, unlocked the door. Inside, the world was small and warm. The father hung up his jacket. The boy kicked off his shoes. Dinner was simple, conversation quiet but full. Before bed, the boy practiced his signs in front of the mirror, exaggerating movements, laughing at himself. The father watched from the doorway. Later, after the boy fell asleep, the father sat alone in the dim living room. He thought about the night that had started everything, the girl on the floor, the fear, the decision to kneel instead of walk away. He thought about how close he had come to doing nothing. He understood now that courage was rarely dramatic. It was not loud. It did not announce itself. It was a choice made in the moment, often unseen, often misunderstood. And sometimes it was simply the refusal to stand up and leave when someone needed you to stay. The city outside continued as it always did, sirens, traffic, life moving forward without pause. Inside the apartment, the father stood and turned off the light. Tomorrow he would go back to work. He would clean floors. He would sign to his son. He would exist in the quiet spaces most people overlooked. And that would be enough, because somewhere along the way, the hospital had learned a new language. And so had he, not one of sound or authority, but one of presence, one that stayed. In the end, nothing about the single father's life looked extraordinary from the outside, and that was precisely the point. He still worked nights, still carried exhaustion in his shoulders, still measured success in small, fragile moments of peace. But the hospital he moved through was no longer the same silent maze of rules it had once been. It had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that safety was not only built through control, but through understanding. The father did not become a symbol, a headline, or a hero spoken about in meetings. He became something quieter and far more lasting, a reminder woven into everyday practice. His son grew up watching how presence could change a room without ever raising a voice. Together they proved that language was not owned by institutions, but carried by those willing to learn it. The world did not suddenly grow gentle, but it made space where fear once lived. And in that space, a man who had always worked in the background taught others how to truly see. Sometimes the most powerful change begins when someone kneels down, stays still, and chooses not to walk away.